Welcome to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast, where our host and expert guests delve into and scrutinize the pressing issues and emerging trends in climate business and climate finance. We greatly appreciate your support. Please like, review, and subscribe to the podcast to help us grow and reach a wider audience. Be sure to take note of the disclaimers at the conclusion of each show. And now, here is your host, investor, analyst, and author, Joseph Giacobelli.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to episode 74 of the Asia Climate Finance Podcast. In this episode, we look at how next-generation nuclear technologies could support Asia's energy transition and the massive rise in electricity demand driven by AI, data centers, and green industrial zones in the region. Today's guest is Stephen Edkins, Chief Executive Officer of Koya Nuclear, a company that focuses on producing and supplying TRISO nuclear fuel for small modular reactors, or SMRs. Stephen brings a rare combination of investment banking experience in Asia's early renewables boom and hands-on work with advanced nuclear fuel supply chains in Europe, Asia, and the US. Some of you may know about TRISO, but in case you don't, just like me before this episode, just a quick explanation. So TRISO stands for Tristructural Isotropic Fuel. It consists of millimeter-sized particles of uranium dioxide coated in 3 protective layers that keep radioactive material contained and stable at temperatures of around 1,300 degrees Celsius. This makes it effectively meltdown-proof in normal and many accident conditions. This proven technology, first developed and tested in Germany and later replicated in Japan, China, and South Africa, is widely seen as one of the safest forms of nuclear fuel and a key enabler for high-temperature Gen 4 reactors and SMRs. In my conversation with Stephen, we explore how SMRs and TRISO fuel fit into national decarbonization strategies, what it will take for these projects to become bankable, and how Asia can use nuclear innovation to build competitive, low-carbon industrial zones. We also discuss supply chains, regulation, and why Stephen expects a sharp acceleration in SMR deployment after the early 2030s. So please stay with us as we unpack where TRISO-based SMRs might generally add value alongside renewables and what needs to happen on policy, finance, and technology to move from pilot to large-scale deployment. As always, please do send us comments, themes, or guest ideas. Our email is at the top of the show notes. Hope you enjoy the discussion. Hello, Stephen. Thank you so much for making it to this episode of the Asia Climate Finance Podcast. How are you today?
Thanks for inviting me. I know I've been knocking on your door for a while, and thanks for finally letting me in.
We're really, really happy that you can make it because it's an important topic. It's a very timely topic. And I think it's one of those things that people are going to be talking about more and more. We've got your bio in the show notes, but could you tell us something about yourself?
So I'll start off with the fact I'm CEO of Koya Nuclear, which is a Irish domiciled company focused on producing and promoting the use of TRISO nuclear fuel. Something which we're going to get into a lot more detail later on. But in terms of my background, originally from the UK, got into investment banking like I think most people did in the mid-90s. Ended up on Wall Street doing Latin America, primarily M&A relating to Spanish banks buying Latin American banks, which was a big thing at the time. And then 2004, I wanted to change, and I'd been reading with interest what was going on in China at the time. Went out to have a look, and a friend of mine said, hey, why don't you come out and we'll see if we can do some deals together. And so then I set up on my own, and it wasn't any great strategy of ours, but we ended up focusing exclusively on renewable energy. And so we really had a ground level view on the birth of the solar industry, the wind industry and the battery industry in China between 2004 and 2012, which was when I went back to Europe.
That's really the early days, right? Of renewable energy, yeah.
There's so many ways to think about it, but I think that in my mind, the best way to think about it would be the size of a factory. So when Suntec went IPO in 2005, that year they produced 50 megawatts of solar panels. I went to I went to see Shi Jinrong at their factory. And it's not 50 megawatts was a good sized plant. I mean, I don't know what it would have been, 10,000 square meters. But you think about it now, you've got Jinko Solar doing 100 gigawatts, right? It's 2,000 times larger. and you can go onto Google Earth and see the size of some of these factories in China, and it's just square kilometers. It really is amazing. I never thought it would get this big.
Right.
I mean, we knew that China could scale up. But it's something to behold. I remember just before we started, you were talking about BYD. So BYD now has their new factory in Zhengzhou is already 50 kilometers squared. And it's just about to double in size again.
Yeah, it's basically the size of a city, right. So given your long experience in Asia Pacific, and I know that now you're global, so you're looking at Europe, North America, etc. But given your long experience in Asia Pacific's renewable energy industry, what are your personal views on the future evolution of the energy transition in the region, just in general?
So I know China best, so I'll continue with China a little bit more, because that's what I have the most data points for. So China now produces more than double the electricity of the US. It's well known that the majority of its electricity comes from coal.
Right.
And the coal percentage, the absolute amount of coal use continued to grow throughout the 2010s. But we have now seen, if you look at the last 5 years, basically coal electricity has stopped growing. And all of the incremental generation capacity that's being built in China is coming from non-fossil fuel sources.
Right.
So next year, I think fossil fuel will be below 50% for the first time, which is already a pretty big achievement. Now, if you ask me what the government policy is towards decarbonisation, I think that's a long-term goal. Yes, they do want to reduce the amount of fossil fuels. But I think it's of secondary importance compared to some of the other goals they have, particularly now with AI boosting electricity demand. I just think like the US also now, we're seeing what I would call an all of the above strategy, which is, hey, we're going to combine a bunch of different types of electricity which allow us to meet our power needs.
Right. Moving the conversation to small modular reactors, SMRs. So small modular reactors are often pitched as a scalable solution for low-carbon baseload power. How are investors and governments currently, just very broadly, responding to SMRs within the broader climate finance ecosystem? Are they seen as bankable assets yet?
So the policy, I call it the policy encouragement level, is quite high at the moment. Everyone is saying the right things. A number of European nations have gone from being outright anti-nuclear to pro-nuclear. And I think a lot of them see SMRs as the way to do it. I think in Asia, you either got countries which are very experienced with nuclear, or you have countries which basically have no experience.
Right.
And so there, it's more about, I think before you even start talking seriously about policy, you need to talk about just getting them comfortable with nuclear in particular. And I think so you're asking about why SMRs are attractive. So I think one reason is they have a much lower footprint than traditional large Gen 2 PWR reactors, right? You don't have an exclusion zone of a kilometer or more. You should be able to have much smaller sites with lower requirements and lower waste. I think in a market like the US, where AI seems to be the main sort of preoccupation, and that's what's really driving policy, I think the advantage of an SMR over it, once you're convinced to do it nuclear, the advantage of an SMR is, in theory, you should be able to do it a lot faster. Okay, so once you have modularization in terms of production, you could have an SMR coming off your production line every week. All right. In theory, it'll only take you a couple of years to commission an SMR. Okay. That's what we're going to discuss a little bit later. The problem is getting to the first one. You get to the first of a kind, you get that modularity in the production going. That's where the delay is right now.
Right. But in order for these assets to be bankable, I guess the first stop would be government policy. You need government policies to be encouraging SMRs.
So it's multifaceted. So if you take something like solar, it was very, very easy. Okay, so all it took really with solar was Spain and Germany having a chunky subsidy for solar power, and that pretty much activated the whole of the solar industry because you got solar production up to sufficient scale, then costs started to come down. With nuclear, yes, you are going to need some sort of subsidies. All right, they can take a variety of forms. It could just be a straight subsidy to payment to electricity coming out of electricity bills. It could ideally be a carbon credit, which can make a significant amount of difference. But I think at this stage, at the early stages, it's more important to see support on the CapEx. And then so non-monetarily, just having a supportive regulatory environment. So the biggest problem in the US that I can see is the costs of getting approval for both the design of a reactor and an individual site are very, very high. And so that's acting despite the Trump administration and most states are pretty pro-nuclear now in the US. But despite that, the regulatory costs are still very, very high.
Got it.
And I think that's,
please.
That's somewhere where I think Asia historically has done much better. If the government gets behind something, it can reduce the amount of friction around getting approvals.
It can turbocharge the whole industry. Still talking about governments and nuclear now, several Asian nations, including like China, South Korea, and increasingly India, are investing heavily in nuclear R&D. And actually, China is building quite a few reactors as well. But how does your startup, Koya Nuclear, position itself within the regional momentum, and what lessons or partnerships are emerging from Asia's approach?
So, yes, the China, Korea, and now India are increasingly, I would say, promoting both the use of and R&D, especially in some of the newer nuclear technologies. Japan, actually, if you look at it just on a historical basis, has been the biggest supporter. In the 90s and 2000s, they were investing $5 billion a year in advanced nuclear. They were the first country to do Gen 3 nuclear. They built the HTTR, which is the first working Gen 4 project after the one that the Germans built in the 80s. So they definitely have the technology to support it. Why would you want to use TRISO, which is what Koya Nuclear is all about? So TRISO is a way to make nuclear fuel effectively safe from meltdown. So you take a millimeter amount of uranium dioxide and then you cover it in 3 different coatings, which mean that it is resistant up to a temperature of 1,300 degrees. Okay, that's the basic proposition. This was designed and rolled out by the Germans. It was tested throughout the world. The Japanese then recreated it. The Chinese have recreated it. South Africans also had a very successful program, which we're very close to. And the only reason that Gen 4 never really happened and TRISO never really happened was this longish spell in the wake of first Chernobyl and then Fukushima, which just dampened overall enthusiasm. But the technology is proven, number one. And I'd say, as importantly, it is, in the DOE's words, the safest form of nuclear fuel that exists. All right? That's why we're behind TRISO, because one, it's been proven, and two, it's safe.
So that's how you're positioning it in the region. Talking about financing a little bit, early stage SMR projects face unique financing hurdles, right? From regulatory uncertainty to long lead times. What instruments, be it blended finance, sovereign guarantees, green bonds, etc., are proving most viable for unlocking capital for projects?
So to get to first of a kind, in other words, to prove not just to investors, but more importantly to regulators that your technology is safe and works, equity is still the predominant form of financing, especially in the US. But we are seeing in other countries, including in Asia, that there are significant government support available. But no, I wouldn't expect any bank financing at that stage. As soon as we've got the first of a kind out of the way, then I think quite quickly you can see other forms of financing come in. I'm not an expert in green bonds. I think, well, I know you know a lot more about them than I do, but I'm pretty sure that that's going to come into it. And then, but no, I think, well, obviously the key to getting the financing done in the end is going to be the offtake. Okay. And we've had a number of conversations, not just with traditional off-takers, but actually some of the big technology companies are interested in getting involved here because they want to build data centers or they want to make sure the data centers which they are contracting to have access to green power. And so I think that's an area where if you get the technology company comfortable with your technology, then they become the off-taker, and then I think the bank financing becomes a lot easier.
Understood. Talking about climate-aligned infrastructure planning, as countries update their nationally determined contributions, and COP30 is going on right now in Belém in Brazil. So as countries update their nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies, are SMRs being integrated into national decarbonization pathways anywhere? What role do you see SMRs in complementing renewables and grid modernization?
So I've talked about the sort of private sector drivers, which tends to be technology companies if it's a data center, or if there are people that are worried about CBAM in Europe, then it could be a smelter, especially in a country which has a lot of coal-fired electricity. Okay, so that's one kind of type of customer that we're talking to. And then, so that would be especially true in India, for instance, South Africa, still China, although to a lesser extent, given the renewable quotient they now have. And then on the government side, I would say nuclear as an overall concept, yes. I think, does that mean they would specifically promote SMRs? I'm not sure, but I do think we're seeing it in maybe more in the sort of state level in some of these Asian countries where they want to set up a green industrial zone, right? So we're talking to a number of jurisdictions in India, let's say, that want to have an SMR as part of their new industrial zone. So I think, at that level, it seems to be resonating quite well.
Understood. Can we talk a little bit about the supply chain and technology localization kind of side of things? SMRs promise modularity, but localization remains key, obviously, for cost reasons and other reasons. How are you approaching this kind of supply chain issue in development in Asia or elsewhere? And what are the implications for cost, for resilience, and for regional competitiveness?
You would certainly think that Asia would be a good place to build scale up modular production of anything, right? In particular modular reactors. So I think over a 10, 15 year time horizon, yeah, I would imagine that Asia would become very strong, not just for domestic markets, but even for export. And if you're talking about a container scale SMR, which is kind of a lot of the mini MRs are trying to do that, then absolutely you'd expect this to be an export good. If we're talking about maybe the slightly larger one of the key things you need to think about is your key components need to be certified. All right. So one of the things you need to remember about with any nuclear plant that you're building is all the key components need to be certified. We're not just talking about a standard ISO certification here. It needs to be it needs to be produced by a certified nuclear plant. And this is very, very difficult to get. So if you're talking about a reactor, the number of companies in the world or plants in the world which are certified to build a nuclear reactor is, you can count it on one, maybe two hands. So I think if you're looking at the supply chain for nuclear, that's a medium-term project. But of course, Asian countries are very, very interested in developing it. In the discussions we're having with India, that issue comes up a lot. They're very keen to build up their local nuclear production base.
Talking a little bit more about TRISO, which is, again, in some ways the bread and butter of Koya Nuclear. Talking about the TRISO fuel market is gaining traction due to the high temperature resilience and the safety profile. Maybe you can talk a little bit about those as well. And I think there's global research funding is surpassing something like 50 mil US in 2024. And Asia is ramping up feasibility studies. How is Koya Nuclear leveraging TRISO's investment momentum? And are financiers beginning to view TRISO-fueled reactors as commercially viable assets?
So I'd seen a big change in the last 12 months where previously even people that had invested in companies with TRISO-based reactors either did not really know much about TRISO or didn't seem to care about it. I think people are starting to care about it because what they've realized is, one, it's a very, very different skill set from designing a reactor. It needs a very, very different team. And almost inevitably, the reactor companies that we know, it's very difficult for them to maintain those two different skill sets in the same company. But more importantly, if you look at the cost component, so if you're calculating the LCOE, when you're talking about adoption of SMRs, in the end, and especially in Asia, that's what it comes down to. You start talking about SMRs in Asia, the first question is always, how much is it going to cost? Right? What's your long-term cost? And whereas with a traditional large nuclear station, where fuel is probably only 10, 15% of the LCOE, in the case of an SMR, it's 30, 35, even 40%.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
So it makes a massive difference. And a lot of the reason why you see calculations which say that SMRs are going to be very expensive. And the reason for that is that people are putting in a very high number for the fuel. And we believe there's actually a lot of cost down there, based on our experience with our team. But imagine you're a reactor provider and you're talking to a client and people are asking you how much it's going to cost. And they realize that actually the most critical conversation is going to be with the TRISO producer. Right. It's not going to be with the reactor producer at all, okay? And so that's what people are realizing. They're saying, actually, what I really need to know is how much does the TRISO cost? And that's why we started talking to some of these big tech companies, because they're chucking money at reactor producers or projects, and then they realize that TRISO is the most important component. They're wondering, how do they de-risk that, okay? And the way that you de-risk it is, one, you have a TRISO producer that has done it before. They've already certified TRISO fuel, which our team has done. Okay. Number two, they've got a clear rollout plan, ideally with a diversified mix of customers. All right. So, so we're de-risked. And that also means that the individual customers are de-risked as well. So it's my prediction that we're actually going to see, in the end, we're going to see a sort of almost like a futures market for TRISO fuel. Because that is such a key component in the overall cost.
But just to be the devil's advocate here, isn't there a danger that then you're going to talk about a very volatile commodity, which just like gas, natural gas for gas-fired power plants? So if you've got 30-40% of your cost base, which is relying on a commodity which has got a volatile price, doesn't that kind of change the economics of the project?
So the volatile part of it is the uranium. So uranium prices have been going up and up, well, been going up mainly recently quite a lot. All right. But that's true of all nuclear power plants.
Right.
And there are ways to at least hedge that or buy uranium forward such that you can at least know what that risk is. Where I'm talking about the bit which is not known today is the extent to which we can get costs down in TRISO manufacturing.
Right.
And we know based on the designs we have, once you get to larger scale, once you get your quality up, the biggest cost is going to be rejecting TRISO because it hasn't met your quality standards. But if we have a clear scale up roadmap and we know what our cost is today, but we also know what it's going to be when production hits 10,000 tons a year, right? Or 100,000 tons. That we can pretty much predict. Okay. And I think we've seen it now in batteries, we've seen it in solar. So when we're talking to clients, we're saying, look, there's no reason to believe that TRISO is going to follow exactly the same trajectory.
Right. Maybe you should have done it earlier, but could you talk a little bit about Koya Nuclear, what it is, how it was born, what it's been doing, its mission, its targets, etc.?
Absolutely. So as I said, it's an Irish domiciled company. We have offices in South Africa and in Singapore. Our business model is we produce TRISO fuel for other reactor companies and other project developers. That TRISO, so I described it as these millimeter-sized particles, that can go into multiple different formats. Some people use spheres, some people use cylinders. We can cope with all of that. But the particles remain exactly the same. And where we are now is we're just about to negotiate a deal to restart production at an existing TRISO line. I can't give you the scoop on that yet.
No worries.
But the reason we want to do that is we know that line has produced TRISO in the past. So it produced certified TRISO in the past. We can put together enough of the old team that did it before. And then when we do that, we're going to create samples which potential clients can use. So this is the first stage of our business model is we're going to create samples and then other people are going to be able to test those samples in their particular format and in their reactors. And that's a big issue because right now, all of these TRISO-based reactor companies, where do they get their TRISO from, right? And so a lot of them are in a design phase, they're in a non-nuclear prototype phase, but very, very soon they're going to need the TRISO if they're going to be the ones that actually successfully enter the market.
And is there any specific geographical focus even, or you're just basically looking at the
in terms of clients? No, we have a pipeline of clients in the US, Europe, and in Asia. We are trying to understand the regulatory rules around moving both uranium and also TRISO itself across different borders. We have partners who are helping us with that. But as it stands right now, in theory, we could supply anybody. And especially at the early stage, when you're just providing samples, it's not such a critical issue.
Right, of course.
We will eventually, once demand hits certain levels, then we will build full-scale commercial plants in different jurisdictions closer to where the final demand is.
Understood. If I can talk about another type of SMRs that has been hitting the headlines in the last few months, few years, and that's thorium reactors. So if you don't mind me speaking a little bit about that. So China's activation of the world's first commercial thorium molten salt reactor in this year, in 2025, has reignited kind of global interest in thorium. And given thorium's abundance and safety advantages, do you see thorium-based systems playing a meaningful role in global or Asia's long-term decarbonization strategy? And what kind of barriers remain to scaling thorium deployment across the region?
Yeah, that Chinese reactor, they announced the successful conversion of thorium actually, when I was in Shanghai, I think it was like 10 days ago, the announcement, I subsequently had a meeting with a Japanese scientist who was involved in that program. So it was originally a collaboration between the Japanese and the Chinese. But that's not the first time people have successfully used thorium. So the original TRISO prototype was THTR 300 in Germany in the 80s. And the reason it was called THTR was because the TH stood for thorium. It was called the thorium test reactor. So they designed that. It was designed to use TRISO, and it was designed to use thorium. And so what they proved was that using TRISO, you could successfully combine uranium and thorium, all right, in a sustainable nuclear reaction. You can't do it without uranium because thorium itself is not fissile. Okay, so you need the uranium to get it started, but once you do, then you can combine it with thorium. And that's important because, firstly, the cost of uranium is high, all right, and uranium is running out, actually. So there's only about 100 years supply left at current demand. And of course, people are building more nuclear power stations, so that's only going to go down. Whereas, as you pointed out, there are at least 1,000, if not 10,000 years worth of thorium. So there's a lot of interest in that. And I'm not familiar with, the exact details of the Chinese molten salt reactor yet. But I do know that the TRISO-based reactor in Germany worked because it was in operation, successfully producing, not just reacting, but producing electricity for 3 years. It was a 300 megawatt plant. I think the one in China is only a couple of megawatts. It's still very small, right? So you ask me, if you want to build a thorium-enabled reactor, I would go for a TRISO-based one.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you for explaining all of that. I don't pretend to be a TRISO thorium expert in any way. Looking now at your outlook, where do you think are the biggest opportunities and the biggest challenges over the next 10, 20 years?
So I think the key to what you need to realize about SMRs is it's horses for courses, all right? There's not one standard design which is going to be dominant. Okay, so you've got a number of different use cases. Let me take, for example, marine. Right, so there are a number of people trying to do SMRs to be put in commercial vessels, and I'm familiar with one of them, and they're using TRISO. Right, so like the common denominator is TRISO, but the format for that reactor is very different from someone who says, "Oh, I want to build a co-located data center."
Right.
All right. It's very different from someone who says using an SMRs for mining. All right. So you've got different formats, you've got different criteria. And so what we've found is when you talk to potential customers, it's actually quite useful to go in not as a reactor vendor, but as a TRISO vendor, because then they ask you, what SMR do you recommend? Right. And so we're not trying to sell the only SMR we've got. We're we're familiar with a variety of different form factors. You've got reactors you can refill dynamically. You've got reactors you refill every 2 years. You've got reactors you refill every 10 years. Very different profiles in terms of the amount of maintenance required. Every single client has different criteria in our experience, right? And so I think that's something which the industry is struggling with today, but it will, in the course of the next 2 or 3 years, I think people will start to work out that you need to match the reactor to the use case.
So where do you think we're going to be by, say, 2040? 15 years from now, in terms of...
This is going to be very asymptotic in the way that I think all renewable energy technologies have been, but probably even more so because of the dynamics of development and the lead times. But once we have 4 or 5 proven SMR designs in circulation and people have got the scalability around the production sorted out, then I think things will go very, very fast. and that's going to happen somewhere around 2032 would be my bet, which is not actually very far away when you think about the length of time it takes just on our side, and in many ways TRISO is quicker than reactors, but planning to build a TRISO line, a complete new TRISO line in a new country with a new team, training them up. These are all things which take 3 to 4 years. And so when we talk to customers, we say, well, do you know where you're getting your TRISO from? And typically the answer is no. You say, you've got a reactor, but there's nothing to go in it. All right. So I think that's the realization that you need to put as much focus on ensuring your reactor and your fuel are both on time.
So potential boom post 2032? Is that what?
Potential what?
Potential boom of the industry.
A boom.
Boom of the industry post 2032?
Yeah, I think that, nuclear is currently, 10% of electricity globally?
Very small, yeah.
Yeah, I see nuclear as part of a mix, but certainly over that timeline, and if decarbonisation is really held to, it should rise. And so nuclear goes up to 20, I see, or even 25, I see SMRs being maybe 20% of that. So 5% of global electricity. I think that's reasonable. What will make it grow faster is if we can really get to a point where you could commission a new SMR in under 2 years, then it's really that's when you get your boom, right? So if we can get that time down from 5, 6 years, 7 years where it is now, once you get that below 2 years, I think all bets are off.
No, that absolutely tend to agree with that. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for participating in the Asia Climate Finance podcast. It was a really, really interesting discussion. It's definitely a discussion that we need to pick up in a few months and get an update on what's going on in this area.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Asia Climate Finance podcast. Please be advised that this podcast is presented for educational purposes only. None of the information provided should be construed in any way as investment advice. Always consult with a licensed investment professional before making any investment decisions. Additionally, please note that the views and opinions expressed by our guests are personal and may not reflect the views and opinions of their current or previous employers.